Today's talk is on Edouard Manet, regarded as the father of modernism. He was one of the first 19th century artists to paint modern life, and an artist who is now seen as a key figure in the transition from realism to Impressionism, even though he resisted joining the Impressionist group and never exhibited at any of their exhibitions. This is a detail from perhaps his best known work, the work Olympia, which at the time was a controversial painting, and many art historians see this painting as the beginning of modernism. This is Edouard Manet, born on the 23rd of January 1832 in Paris, into a wealthy and well-connected family. His father, Auguste Manet, was a high-ranking civil servant. His mother, Eugénie Fournier, was the daughter of a diplomat. Now, his father was a domineering presence in his life and wanted Manet to pursue a career in law, but Manet had always shown an early interest in art, and in 1848 his father enrolled him in a naval training programme, but Manet failed the entrance exam, and his father in the end reluctantly allowed him to study art. So in 1850 he began studying under Thomas Couture, who was a prominent academic painter at the time and emphasised the importance of history painting. But Manet's desire was always to depict modern life. He studied with Couture for 6 years, but quickly became dissatisfied with the traditional academic training and was inspired, though, by the works of Diego Velázquez, Franz Hals, Francisco Goya, and he saw their works in Paris and in Italy, Germany and Spain. What he admired was their bold use of colour, direct brushwork, the unidealized depictions of their subject. Now, this self-portrait was painted much later, when he was around 47 years old, and in fact a few years before his death in 1883, and at the time he was gravely ill with syphilis, yet he shows himself still working. And by this time, Manet was gaining greater acceptance within the art world, despite all the controversies that had sort of set back or marred his earlier career. And 1879 was a turning point in his life, as he was awarded the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honour, an acknowledgement of his growing influence in French art. But as I said, this period also marked the beginning of the end, as his syphilis was developing and it increasingly debilitated him. This is an important work because it marks the beginning of his career. It's the Absinthe Drinker, and it shows that even early on he was willing to challenge the conventions of French academic painting. He's shown the man as a solitary figure. We presume it's a beggar or bohemian, standing in the dark against a featureless background. He's standing alongside a glass of absinthe, which was a highly alcoholic drink. It was associated with the darker side of Parisian life. He has tattered clothing, a melancholy expression, and he could be seen as an outsider. And Manet has chosen this unglamorous subject for this early painting, and that subject is what set him apart from other academic painters who typically focused on grand historical events, mythological themes and so on. And this shows Manet's commitment to realism. The Paris at the time was undergoing rapid social and cultural changes, and absinthe was a potent symbol of those changes. The model was someone called Collardet. He was a well-known Parisian street character, and the figure is painted in a manner which recalls the grand tradition of Spanish painting, particularly the work of Diego Velázquez, who Manet greatly admired. The stance, the dramatic lighting are all reminiscent of Velázquez portraits. But Manet, whereas Velázquez would show court figures, Manet has subverted this tradition by focusing on the margins of society. Despite its technical brilliance, it was rejected by the Salon of 1859, and this begins the fraught relationship Manet had with the French art establishment. It was probably rejected because of the subject matter, which was deemed inappropriate for high art. Manet was undeterred. He would continue to paint scenes of modern life, as we will see, and he's continued to paint these controversial subjects. One of the intriguing aspects of this painting is the composition, the plain dark background, which draws attention to the man's isolation, the stark contrast between the figure and the surroundings, and the minimalism of the background. Incidentally, before I go on, Absinthe was called the Green Fairy because it was often associated with madness and hallucinations, and Manet's depiction of the drinker is far from sensationalized. He presents the figure with a sort of quiet dignity, a decision that further distinguishes his approach from that of other contemporary artists. Surprised Nymph. The model is Suzanne Leenhoff, who was Manet's former piano teacher. Let me explain how a piano teacher became his model. In 1851, so 10 years before, his father hired a Dutch piano teacher called Suzanne Leenhoff in order to teach Manet and his brother music. But Manet and Leenhoff became romantically involved, and this lasted 10 years until Manet left home, when they began to live together. And all this time, it's believed they managed to keep the relationship secret from his father. And it's also been suggested that Leenhoff was his father's mistress. Now, she had a son, Léon, and he was referred to as her younger brother. And in case you're wondering about the birth certificate, on the birth certificate, the father has a name which has never been traced. It's believed to have been invented. Now, Manet and Leenhoff finally married in 1863, which was a year after his father died. But still, Manet never publicly confirmed Léon was his son, and some have suggested that the father of Léon could have been Manet's own father. Manet considered this one of his most important works, and it reminds us of this painting, Susanna and the Elders by Rembrandt. The names are the same, they're both Dutch, and the pose is similar. Manet kept the work in his studio all his life, although he did exhibit it in 1865. Now, The Spanish Singer was one of Manet's first great successes. Not all of his paintings were rejected. It was accepted by the Salon of 1861. And although Manet painted works that were often rejected by the Salon, he aspired to be shown in the Salon, which is one of the reasons he didn't associate himself closely with the Impressionists. He saw himself as a modern painter, but one who was painting in a style that should be accepted by the Salon. This work shows a young man in traditional Spanish costume sitting on a bench strumming a guitar, a confident expression, almost defiant, gazing out towards us with a bold look. It demonstrates Manet's fascination with the Spanish culture, which would remain a significant influence through his life. Spain, in fact, held a particular allure for French artists in the 19th century, and Manet was drawn to these Spanish subjects partly through the influence of Diego Velázquez and Francisco Goya. Although when he painted this in 1860, he hadn't yet visited Spain, and he painted this studying the works of Velázquez and other Spanish masters at the Louvre, and he was here capturing the vividness and authenticity of Spanish life as he imagined it. It's a study in contrasts, the colourful costume offset by the simplicity of the background again, the detailed rendering of the fabric, the guitar and other objects. Contrast with the sort of looser impressionistic brushstrokes for his face and hands. The guitar, for example, is painted with a precision that reflects Manet's interest in texture and details of everyday objects. The reason he chose the Spanish singer wasn't only because of his interest in Spanish culture, but he was also breaking away again from academic traditions of painting by focusing on a common musician rather than historical scene or a mythological event. It was nevertheless still received well at the Salon. It earned him an honourable mention. It established him with as a serious artist. He became a known artist within the art world, and it set the tone for much of his later work. Another early work, Music in the Tuileries, is a depiction of Parisian society enjoying a concert in the Tuileries garden, which was a popular gathering place for the upper class. It's a departure from traditional compositions because it's a crowded scene of a modern-day event, well-dressed Parisians, many of whom were Manet's friends and acquaintances. It's a dynamic and dense composition. Figures overlap, they're jostling for space. It creates a sense of movement and spontaneity. There are a lot of Manet's friends and well-known figures in the crowd. The poet Charles Baudelaire, the composer Jacques Offenbach, and Manet himself. Manet is standing at the far left, the one gazing directly out at us. And the man next to him is his friend Albert de Balleroy. So there's a lot of people that could be identified in this painting. It has, as you can see, loose brushwork and innovative composition, both praised and criticised at the time. The traditionalists found the painting or criticised the painting for its lack of a clear focal point, which they found disorienting. But the progressive critics appreciated the sense of immediacy and the focus on modern life. It reflects Manet's fascination and continued fascination with Parisian bourgeoisie and their leisure activities. It's a sort of snapshot of social interactions and fashion. The inclusion of Charles Baudelaire was, he was a significant poet at the time and one of Manet's most vocal supporters. Baudelaire championed Manet's work as an example of modern art which embraced the realities of contemporary urban life rather than retreating into the past. Perhaps his most famous work, 1863, Olympia, and also, particularly at the time, his most controversial work, a reclining nude woman gazing directly out at us. The model is Victorine Muron. She's lying in a bed draped with white sheets. She's illuminated by a strong light, an all-round light. Notice the shadows are minimal, and her body contrasts with the dark background, a technique that we've already seen that Manet often uses. At the foot of the bed, there's a black cat with an arched back staring out at us. The other side of the bed, there's a maid who's presenting Olympia with a bouquet of flowers, likely from a male admirer, possibly, of course, us. So we're put in the position of the viewer who is being stared at by Olympia and the cat. The stare, the forthright stare of Olympia, in some ways is an invitation, but it's more a blank stare, I think, an accepting stare. The flowers she's being offered, she's ignoring. Perhaps they're a gift to her from us. The arched back of the cat suggests the cat is anxious, apprehensive of our presence. Perhaps it's never seen us before, or perhaps, more disturbingly, it has seen us before. It was exhibited at the Salon of 1865 and provoked scandal. Critics were shocked by the boldness of the stare. It broke all the traditions of idealised female nudes, and there's nothing about it that enables us to interpret it as a reclining Venus, a mythological figure. It's not a mythological figure, it's modern Parisian woman, presumably a courtesan. It's a unapologetic presentation of a real contemporary woman. It's not an abstract symbol of beauty or idealised in any way, and it challenges the social and artistic norms of the period. Of course, there are precedents, which we've seen in another of my talks on Titian. It's one of its precedents is the Venus of Urbino, of course, by Titian. And Manet has subverted these traditional references. There's a black cat rather than Titian's a dog, which symbolised loyalty. So there's a strong hint of Olympia's sexual independence. The bouquet of flowers suggests a transactional nature of the relationship. There's a it's hardly even thinly veiled reference. There's a reference to the world of prostitution that many upper-class men in Paris at the time frequented, but never discussed, rarely saw reflected, or I think I would say never saw reflected in respectable art. The flower in her hair and the ribbon round her neck were incidentally both symbols used by sex workers in 19th century France to indicate their profession. One of the critics, Paul de Saint-Victor, referred to the painting as a courtesan with dirty hands and wrinkled feet lying on a bed between the sheets, looking like she's about to invite you in. The reception was so negative that the painting was displayed high on a wall, so it was protected from physical attack. But it did mark a turning point in Manet's career. And although many critics attacked it for its vulgarity, it did have defenders because they saw it as a revolutionary depiction of modern life, like Émile Zola. He praised the painting and its honest depiction of the contemporary world. Incidentally, the model I mentioned, Victorine Muron, as well as being a model, was an artist in her own right, and she would later exhibit her own works at the Salon. She was one of the few women in her time, we'll see another later, to gain recognition in this male-dominated world of art. Another controversial painting, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, one of his, or another of his most famous and controversial works, two clothed men seated on the grass having a picnic. A nude woman they seem to pay little attention to casually reclines beside them, and there's another woman in the background bathing in a stream, shown larger than life size. The painting was rejected by the Salon, but there were so many paintings rejected this year that Napoleon III decided to hold a Salon des Refusés, a salon for rejected works, and Manet's painting became, so it was seen, it was exhibited in the Salon des Refusés, and it became the subject of heated debate. The figures in the painting you could regard as modelled after the famous works of Giorgione and Titian, but again Manet subverted them by putting them in the contemporary setting. Although the nude woman, could be seen as a Venus type, she's shown unidealized, and her companions, the men, are wearing conventional contemporary formal attire, directly challenging the conventions of depicting female nudity. Now, I know that was done in by Titian, showing two conventionally dressed men alongside a female nude, but that was presented as a mythological subject. Manet's woman is clearly a real person, and there's no mythological or allegorical pretext. The central nude figure is again Victorine Muron, painted with a naturalism. The time when it was exhibited, critics were also outraged by what they saw as a lack of finish in the painting. The loose visible brushstrokes were considered inappropriate for a painting of this size. It's over 2.5 meters wide. The sense of depth was also unconventional. The background figure, as I said, is with conventional perspective. The woman in the background is too large for her supposed distance from the viewer, and this distortion was a deliberate act on Manet's part, but again it was one of the things that was criticised. So Manet was deliberately provoking the art world of the time, and it's his attempt to break free from the constraints of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, the Academy of Fine Art that imposed its view on what was acceptable at the Salon and in the art world. And in a way, this painting and the previous painting paved the way for the Impressionist movement. Not that they follow a lot of the Impressionists en plein air, bright colours and so on, but in terms of breaking the expected conventions of the art world. Despite the controversy, Manet considered this painting one of his most important works, and he was adamant it should be included in future exhibitions. And he revisited the scene in later paintings. Just before I leave, point out a few symbols in the painting, often not noticed. If you look carefully at the bottom far left, you can see a frog, and the 19th century French slang is grenouille, frog, was a derogatory word for a sex worker. or a promiscuous woman. The basket of fruit as well, long been a symbol of fertility and sensuality. Its contents are scattered, indicating indulgence and abundance. And a little known fact is that Émile Zola defended this painting as well, because he saw it as representing the modern world and showing how people truly lived. He also admired the loose brushstrokes, which offended many critics. He saw it as a sign of technical innovation. So views were mixed. Here, Manet has engaged himself with a completely different subject. It's a historical scene. It's the Battle of Kearsarge and the Alabama. It was a significant event in the American Civil War, but it took place just off the coast of France, 7 miles off Cherbourg. The battle was between the Union ship, the USS Kearsarge, and the Confederate ship, the CSS Alabama. And Manet was fascinated by the drama. He wasn't actually present at the scene, although many were, because it was so near the coast. Many went out in boats to see the action. It was reported in newspapers. There were engravings of the scene, and Manet has taken these as evidence of what happened. The composition is dominated by the sea. We can see Manet's characteristic loose brushstrokes very clearly here. The USS Kearsarge looms in the background, but it's the Alabama that has been mortally wounded and beginning to sink, as you can see. Now, the Alabama had previously destroyed or captured 65 Union merchant ships, but at the time it was in the port of Cherbourg for repairs. But the captain, knowing or seeing that the Kearsarge was approaching, decided to leave the port and engaged, even though the Alabama wasn't fully repaired. The painting captures the immediacy of the action. There's smoke, debris filling the scene. It's dynamic. It's an intense atmosphere. And Manet clearly is fascinated with this contemporary event and wanted to engage with modern history. He'd never painted a battle scene before. His treatment is unconventional. Many typical historical paintings focus on the human drama. They show close-ups of sailors involved in the conflict, whereas here Manet has stepped back and is showing the destructive power of the ships and the sea. We can hardly see the sailors. They're dwarfed by the scale of the ships and the vastness of the ocean. It was exhibited in Paris shortly after the battle. It was well received by critics and the public, and was a turning point in his career because it showed he was able to handle grand historical subjects and still maintain his modern impressionistic style. It was praised for its dramatic realism and his ability to capture the violence and chaos of war, even though he hadn't, of course, witnessed the event firsthand. We know that he originally planned to depict the aftermath of the battle and show survivors in lifeboats struggling to reach the shore. But after further consideration, he decided to focus on the climactic moment of the Alabama's destruction. This is the Pfeiffer, 1866, again inspired by Spanish art, particularly Diego Velázquez. It shows a young boy in simple military uniform playing a fife. There's a flat, almost featureless background. There's a direct gaze. He's staring out at us. His figure is sharply defined. there's a sense of focus and immediacy. There was a strong interest in soldiers' uniform at the present time under the Second Empire, under Napoleon III, but Manet does show here a young boy rather than a grand senior officer in the army. He painted it after a trip to Spain in 1865, where he became even more influenced by the simplicity and directness of Velázquez portraits. The focus is entirely on the sitter. He also admired Francesco Goya and sought to bring the same intensity and presence to his portraits. It was submitted to the Salon of 1866, but rejected, much to Manet's frustration. We don't know why it was rejected, of course, but it was likely tied to the unconventional treatment of space and perspective. The figure seems to almost float in front of a flat background, and Manet has done little to create the traditional illusion of depth that was expected. He was accused, in fact, by some people who saw this painting of lacking technical skill, although, of course, we know that's not the case. The boy is believed to be, through his uniform, a member of the Imperial Guard. The stance and expression convey his youthful energy. And as I said, Manet chose to portray a common soldier rather than a heroic or allegorical figure. It's now, despite its initial rejection, it's now considered one of his masterpieces and pushes the boundary, as we now see it, of contemporary painting. Interestingly, Napoleon III, when he saw the painting, reportedly fell in love with it, but the Salon jurors remained unconvinced. So even the emperor's personal approval didn't prevent it being rejected from the official exhibition. This is portrait of Émile Zola, one of his, of course, as I've said, one of his ardent supporters, but a very well-known novelist. It shows him seated at a desk surrounded by his books and papers. There's a Japanese screen behind him, very fashionable at the time. There's a reproduction of Olympia on the wall, reflecting Zola's intellectual pursuits, his awareness of the latest fashion, his admiration for Manet's work. He's in a thoughtful pose. His hand is resting on a book. His gaze is directed away from us, suggesting he's deep in thought, deeply engaged with a world of ideas. It's a respectful and intimate painting. It captures Zola's intellectual strength, and the inclusion of Japanese art is a sort of a nod towards the growing interest in Japonism in the 1860s in France. It was exhibited at the Salon of 1868. It was well received, and Zola's calm, dignified presence contrasts with the conventional subject matter of Manet's earlier portraits. It's a restrained palette. There's a careful attention to detail of all the objects. And as I said, Manet had a deep friendship with Zola. And Zola had written a glowing article defending Olympia. Manet was seen now to be a leader of a new artistic movement that would break away from the constraints of the Académie des Beaux-Arts. And this painting is a token of gratitude that Manet expresses towards Zola's unwavering support. The book in Zola's hand is a copy of his own novel, it does underscore that he's both a writer and an intellectual. You can also see in the background, as well as the Japanese print, partly hidden by Olympia, there's a lithograph of Diego Velázquez, The Triumph of Bacchus. This is the execution of Emperor Maximilian, a tragic event when Maximilian, the first emperor of Mexico, was executed by firing squad in 1867, the previous year. So it's a modern historical painting. He's captured the moment of the execution when the emperor and his companions face the firing squad, their arms partly raised. The soldiers are shown in French uniform, and they dominate the composition and give a sense of overwhelming force and the inevitability of the scene. Manet was deeply affected by the political implications of Maximilian's execution. It was seen to be a direct result of the French intervention in Mexico under Napoleon III, and so this can be seen as a criticism of the French government for a failed foreign policy, although Manet was careful to avoid direct political statements in his work. But we can see here the comment on contemporary events is unmistakable, because as I said, the soldier's uniform is not Mexican but French, showing the French bore responsibility for the emperor's fate. It was inspired partly by this work, Francisco Goya's The 3rd of May, 1808, which depicts again an execution. And like Goya's painting, Manet is emphasising the power imbalance between the executioners and their victims. The figures are, as in the Goya painting, standing helpless before the faceless firing squad, and in both cases hands are being lifted. Goya's work is more dramatic and emotional. Manet's is cooler, more detached. Manet actually created several versions of the painting, each one slightly different in composition and detail. This one in the Kunsthalle in Mannheim is the largest and most complete. It was never exhibited in France in his lifetime, possibly because of its political nature. It remained in his studio, largely unseen by the public, and it was only after his death that it began to receive recognition as one of his most important historical paintings. The details are shown with a sort of chilling accuracy. The soldiers' rifles are raised in unison. There's a sort of mechanical precision in their actions. Although Manet, of course, wasn't present at the execution, there were many contemporary detailed newspaper reports and lithographs of the execution, and Manet used that material to recreate the scene. A very different painting, The Balcony. It's a portrait of 3, possibly 4 figures standing on a Parisian balcony. The painting features, leaning on the balcony, Berthe Morisot, a fellow artist and future sister-in-law of Manet. She is sitting alongside Antoine Guillaumet, a landscape painter, behind, and Fanny Klaus, a violinist, standing alongside her. And it's very hard to see, you can just about make it out. If you look in the shadows on the left, there's a boy, possibly Manet's son, Léon. And the use of a balcony adds a layer of intrigue, as it creates a sort of visual barrier between us and the figures. Again, Manet may have been inspired by a work of Goya, this work, the Maillards on the balcony. Similar leaning on the balcony, two figures in the background, partly hidden. The balcony very prominent and cutting across the painting. Manet's figures, though, are more delicate and contrast against the dark background and green shutters. The bright white dresses dominate the composition. He has a bold use of colour and a sharp contrast between the white of the dress and the dark of the background. It was exhibited at the Salon of 1869 and it received mixed reviews. Many thought the unconventional composition and his use of colour were unacceptable, overly harsh, one said. The unusual perspective, the disconnected arrangements of the figures, the sense of unease that many felt when viewing the picture caused them to criticise it. However, many others praised his innovative approach to portraiture and the ability he had of capturing a fleeting moment of modern life. Berthe Morisot played a significant role in his life and career. She was a close friend, collaborator, and would go on to become a leading figure in the Impressionist movement. And it shows, her inclusion in this painting shows the growing influence of women in the Parisian art world. This is the railway. Perhaps in some ways Manet's most enigmatic work and modern painting. There's two figures, a woman seated and reading, a young girl standing beside her, facing away from us, looking through a black iron fence at smoke rising from a passing train. It's the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris, one of the busiest railway stations at the time, a symbol of the Industrial Revolution. Why the woman is sitting there reading, we don't know, surrounded by dirty smoke from the train, but her expression is calm. The girl is curious, suggesting a tension between the old and the new, between tradition and progress. It's notable for its ambiguous narrative and modern composition. It was criticised again when it was exhibited at the Salon of 1874 for its unconventional subject matter and the iron fence, which was seen to be too strong a division between two distinct areas, and people wondered why he showed it in this way. But of course, that was entirely his intention, to create this sense of disconnection between the modern world, shown literally and figuratively either side of the iron fence. The model is Victorine Muron, who became Manet's favourite model. She posed for him for Olympia and Les Déjeuners sur l'Herbe, and here she's shown in a more subdued maternal role. Her presence is still striking. Her blue dress contrasts with the muted tones of the background, drawing attention to her calm, almost introspective expression. It was, again, mixed reviews. Some critics praised its modernity, others found the composition puzzling, as I said. It lacks any clear narrative. It's difficult to work out what's going on, what's the story behind it, how are we to read it, which people liked to do at the time. And that's what upset some people. They didn't know how to make sense of it. There is an interesting fact about it, of course, is that although it's called the railway, you can't actually see much of a railway. There's no train visible. You can see instead the smoke left by the train. I should point out before moving on, this was exhibited in 1874, and that was the year of the first exhibition to be held by what were later called the Impressionists. And they held 8 exhibitions over the next 12 years. And interestingly, Manet did not exhibit at any of them, although he's regarded and was at the time one of the major influences on the Impressionists, particularly his breaking with conventions and the representation of the modern world. Of course, artists who did exhibit, like Monet, Renoir, Sisley, Pissarro, Degas, Morisot, were all friends of Manet, were, as I said, influenced by his work, but adopted a different approach. A lot of their painting was en plein air, was outside, was using a different palette, and was capturing a more sort of fleeting expression, whereas Manet's work is more solid in its approach, even though he has a very loose brushwork. Even more loose here, because I think he's in the garden of Monet. It's Monet's family and their garden at Argenteuil, and Manet here is painting more in the style of Claude Monet. He is showing Monet on the left here doing some gardening, his wife Camille in their Saint-Jean, sitting looking at us. It was created during a visit to Argenteuil, where Monet and his family lived. Many of the Impressionist painters would visit there to paint en plein air. It's unusual in that in this painting, conventionally to show the Monet family, you'd show the 3 of them together. In other words, Monet sitting with his wife and son. But in this case, he's shown them separate. Monet is slightly removed, almost as if he was an observer. He's doing some gardening. He's engaged in another activity. It's reported that Manet actually struggled with the depiction of the garden. He found it difficult to capture the natural light and complained to Monet about the challenge of painting on plein air, because Manet, unlike Monet, tended to paint in the studio. He found out that painting outside was much harder than it looked. But they got on well together. During his visit, we know that they would often exchange painting tips, and despite their different approaches, Monet later credited Manet with encouraging him to pursue some of his bolder experiments with light. This is Nana. What we see is a young, fashionable woman standing before a mirror in an opulent bedroom. She's dressed in a pale blue corset and a white petticoat. She's looking out at us while a man, seated on a couch, observes her. Manet has captured the intimate world of Parisian demi-monde, and Nana was widely interpreted as being a courtesan or kept woman. That is a figure associated with wealth, luxury, and a certain social ambiguity. The demi-monde was the half-world between the respectable and the unacceptable. It was inhabited by marginal figures such as kept women, but those who could afford the latest fashions and present themselves as respectable. She's shown here gazing out boldly towards us, a gaze that would have been startling to contemporary viewers. The painting, of course, was inspired by Émile Zola's novel Nana, of the same name. It told a story of a young actress and courtesan who used her beauty to rise to prominence in Parisian society. And although Manet painted this work before Zola's novel was published in 1880, the title and the subject matter clearly reference the same social circumstances. She's not showing any in any demeaning way. She has, in fact, a sense of power and control, suggesting she's fully aware of her allure, her attraction, and the influence it grants her over men. It was rejected by the Salon of 1877 as being too provocative. Manet is showing a woman in her underwear staring directly out at the viewer. It would have been seen as indecent by many critics. Nevertheless, it was displayed in the window of a gallery in Paris, where it attracted a great deal of attention and even scandal. And it's regarded as one of Manet's key works. It places us in a somewhat voyeuristic position. We wonder what we're doing there, looking at this scene. She's looking out at us as if she's being admired by another viewer, by us. Yet, although traditional portraits of women are shown in domestic or passive roles, not here. Nana exudes confidence. A direct gaze, a confident stance, and she's challenging the traditional notions of the time of femininity and respectability. The figure of Nana was actually based on a well-known actress and courtesan at the time, Henriette Hauser, who was famous for her beauty and charm. And Hauser was one of the many actresses who blurred that line I mentioned between public celebrity and private luxury in Parisian society. In the conservatory, despite the fashionable couple seated in a conservatory, and at the time meeting in a conservatory was regarded as a very fashionable thing to do. This particular conservatory is the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. It's filled with exotic plants, providing a vibrant and natural background. It's a masterful exploration of tension between the couples, who, despite their physical proximity, appear emotionally distant from one another. The conservatory, as I said, was a fashionable place to meet, but the way it's been depicted by Manet, this sense of enclosure, the sense of the couple being trapped, he's used the exotic foliage of the conservatory to provide this surrounding, this backcloth, almost sort of curtain behind them. The man is fully engaged. He's watching her closely, but she doesn't meet his eye. She's looking away slightly, as if lost in thought. It leads us to wonder what's happened between them, what's she thinking about. It was exhibited at the Salon of 1879, praised for its technical skill, criticised for the emotional coldness being shown by the woman, and critics did note the lack of connection between the two figures. It was speculated that Manet was commenting on the superficial nature of bourgeois relationships in Paris at the time. The woman's dress is shown in detail, highlighting the importance of Parisian fashion. Her gloves, her parasol all suggest she's a woman of status. But the demeanour hints at restrictions placed on women of the upper classes. The man is much more casual. He's at ease in the situation. The models, actually, it was modelled by a couple of Manet's friends, Guillaume and Julie Guillemette, and they were friends who were involved in the art world. He's used them to, I don't think this is a comment on his friend's relationship. He's used them in order to portray what he saw as the superficial nature of bourgeois relationships. Now we come towards the end of his life and the last major painting he completed just a year before his death in 1883. A bar at the Folies Bergère. We see a barmaid standing behind the counter at the then famous Folies Bergère nightclub in Paris, popular entertainment venue during the late 19th century. There's a large mirror behind her, and we see her reflected in the mirror, and we see in front of her reflected in the mirror a man wearing a top hat. Maybe that's us standing in front of her. We also see a bustling crowd reflected in the mirror. The man appears to be engaging her in conversation, but she looks dead to the conversation. The mirror creates a very complex visual narrative. There are multiple layers of reality and reflection. The reflection, the mirror appears to be straight on the wall. You can see the bottom of the mirror, that gold band behind her, but the reflection is off to one side. And we know from X-ray analysis and from studies that Manet moved the barmaid a number of times in order to achieve this intentional effect. The painting's composition and interpretation are perplexing. The woman, as I said, is standing directly in front of us, yet her reflection is off to one side. And that's led to many ideas, speculations about what it might mean. The fractured nature of modern life, a comment on the illusory nature of art itself. There's so many interpretations. Every art historian seems to write a different one. In fact, there's even a book called 12 Views of Manet's Bar, and each of the 12 chapters is written by a different art historian and has a different, in some cases, a completely different interpretation of what this painting means and what's significant about it. It was exhibited at the Salon of 1882. It was again celebrated and criticised. Some people saw it and appreciated the complexity of modern life demonstrated in this painting. Others were confused by its apparent inconsistencies. It has, as many saw it, this theme of isolation in the midst of a crowd, a reflection on the way that many feel isolated in this modern world. It's a fitting culmination, I think, of Manet's career, in which he'd consistently explored the tensions of modern life. It was a time when he was starting to suffer badly from syphilis. His health was in steep decline. He continued to work on the painting. He had to be carried to the studio to finish the work. But despite his illness, he insisted on completing it, and it would be one of the last contributions he made. He developed gangrene in his left leg. His leg had to be amputated, and he died a few months later from complications arising from the amputation, from the gangrene, and from the syphilis. I leave you with a detail from that painting, the enigmatic expression of the barmaid, a reflection, I think, of an expression that reflects the way we all sometimes feel in this modern, fast-moving world. So thank you for your time and attention, and I hope that you'll continue the journey with me through the history of Western art. Thank you.